8 people are dead. The most advanced B-52 ever built is gone, and somewhere in the wreckage scattered across the California desert lies the only piece of technology that could have secured America's bomber fleet for the next 30 years. There is no backup. There is no replacement. And the Air Force has a decision to make that nobody saw coming this soon. But here's the question nobody is asking yet. Was the crash of this aircraft a tragic accident? Or was it the inevitable consequence of trying to give a 70-year-old bomber a brain that belongs in the 21st century? The B-52 Stratofortress has been flying since 1955. It has outlasted every aircraft designed to replace it. It survived budget cuts, technology revolutions, and the end of the Cold War it was originally built to fight. Right now, it is in the middle of the most ambitious upgrade program in its history, a $48.6 billion transformation designed to keep it flying until the 2050s. And the single most critical aircraft in that entire program just crashed and burned on departure from Edwards Air Force Base. In the next several minutes, you'll understand what was actually on board that aircraft, and why its loss is far more serious than any standard crash. You'll discover the hidden vulnerability in the B-52's design that becomes most dangerous at exactly the moment this aircraft was lost. You'll understand what a $48.6 billion bet on a 70-year-old airframe actually means, and what happens when the leading edge of that bet disappears in a fireball over the Mojave Desert. And you'll see why this crash raises a question the United States Air Force must now answer. Stay with this, because the full story is not what it first appears. At 11:20 a.m. Pacific Time, on the morning of June 15, 2026, a B-52H Stratofortress began its takeoff roll at Edwards Air Force Base, nestled in California's Mojave Desert. The aircraft lifted off. Then, almost immediately, something went catastrophically wrong. Within seconds of becoming airborne, the aircraft was engulfed in flames. Aerial footage captured what was left of the crash site, which was almost nothing. Smoke rose from the desert floor, visible from hundreds of miles away, a column of black rolling upward, the kind of smoke that comes from tens of thousands of pounds of jet fuel igniting at once. Emergency crews responded immediately. There was nothing they could do. 8 people aboard that aircraft, crew members, civilian personnel, and flight test specialists, did not survive. The Air Force released a brief statement confirming the incident and stating that the cause was under investigation. But as those words were being published, defense analysts and aviation experts were already looking at something very specific. A tail number, 60061, and that number changes everything about this story. Most B-52 crashes, as rare as they are tragedies. This one was a strategic setback. Because 60061 was not an ordinary B-52H, in December 2025, just 6 months ago, Boeing's technicians at their facility in San Antonio, Texas, completed a modification to this specific aircraft unlike anything done to a B-52 before. They installed the AN/APQ-188, an active electronically scanned array radar system, the same foundational technology that powers the targeting suite on the F/A-18 Super Hornet, one of the most capable fighter aircraft in the American inventory. Think about what that means. A radar designed for a cutting-edge strike fighter, integrated into a bomber that was designed when Dwight Eisenhower was president. This wasn't a software update. This wasn't a new communications package. This was a fundamentally new brain, a next-generation sensor suite capable of mapping terrain with extraordinary precision, identifying targets with fighter-grade resolution, and processing battlefield data at a level that the original B-52 designers could not have imagined. And on top of the AN/APQ-188, this aircraft was carrying an AI-integrated avionics package, the AI brain that the Air Force intended to eventually install across the entire B-52H fleet. 60061 was the first B-52 in history to carry both systems simultaneously. Its mission for all of 2026 was to put those systems through every test imaginable: ground checks, systems integration testing, flight envelope evaluation, edge case scenarios modeled on real combat conditions, including the kind of contested airspace the Air Force expects to fight in for the next 3 decades. Every single data point gathered from this aircraft was going to feed the production decision for all 76 B-52H bombers in the fleet. Every B-52 that ever carries a next-generation radar traces its lineage to what 60061 was supposed to prove. But 60061 never came back. And here is where the story takes a turn that the Air Force did not see coming. There is a detail buried in this story that reframes the entire significance of what happened. 60,061 was not one test aircraft among several. It was the only one. There was no second test bed for the AN/APQ-188 integration program. No spare aircraft on standby at a different base. No backup carrying a duplicate set of systems. This single B-52H was the sole vehicle through which the Air Force was planning to validate the most critical upgrade in the history of the world's longest-serving bomber. A former NTSB investigator quoted in the aftermath of the crash was direct about the inherent risk. A flight test is always riskier than normal operations. That's why you have specially trained test pilots and additional safety protocols. That risk was known. The test crew on board was trained for exactly this kind of mission. But the loss of the only test aircraft in a program of this magnitude, with no immediate replacement ready, means the entire modernization timeline just shifted. Think about what that means in practical terms. The Air Force now has to build a new test bed from scratch, source a replacement aircraft, complete the modification process, install the AN/APQ-188, conduct ground integration checks, and begin the flight test program again, from the very beginning. By most estimates, that process takes months. Months the modernization program didn't plan to lose. But here's the question that's going to define the investigation. Was the crash caused by something external to the new systems? Or is there a possibility, not yet confirmed, not yet proven, but not yet ruled out, that the new technology itself contributed in some way to what happened? That's the question the investigation will have to answer, and the answer matters enormously, because the path forward looks very different depending on what the data shows. To understand why the B-52H is particularly vulnerable during takeoff, you have to understand something unusual about how this aircraft actually flies, something that surprises almost everyone who first hears it. The B-52H has no ailerons, not upgraded ailerons, not modified ailerons, no ailerons. Every other large fixed-wing aircraft in the world uses ailerons, the control surfaces on the trailing edge of the wing, to bank and roll the aircraft. The B-52H uses a different system entirely. It banks using hydraulically actuated spoilers, panels built directly into the wing surface that work by disrupting lift asymmetrically, essentially breaking the airflow on one side of the aircraft to induce a controlled bank in that direction. It is a remarkable piece of engineering. It works, but it also means the aircraft is entirely dependent on hydraulic control power for every maneuver it makes. The B-52H's stability augmentation system places complete reliance on hydraulics for both the rudder and the elevators. The horizontal stabilizer, which handles trim and rotation authority on takeoff, is hydraulically adjustable and carries enough aerodynamic authority to rotate 488,000 pounds of aircraft off a runway. 488,000 pounds. Entirely dependent on hydraulics working perfectly. Now consider the failure analysis picture that creates. Any hydraulic anomaly, any avionics event that corrupts the flight control bus, or any runaway trim condition on departure, leaves the crew with almost no recovery window during the critical phase of takeoff. You are low. You are slow. You are committed to the climb. And the complexity of this flight control system leaves very little margin for error in that phase. The B-52H was engineered for cruise operations at altitude, where there is time and altitude and speed to work through problems. The departure phase is where it is most exposed. That's precisely where 60061 was lost. The investigation has not yet determined whether a hydraulic anomaly was involved, but that question is almost certainly going to be one of the first things investigators examine. And it's not the only vulnerability the investigation will look at. Here is the uncomfortable arithmetic of operating a 70-year-old aircraft. The B-52H airframes currently flying were built in the early 1960s. The youngest aircraft in the fleet has been flying for over 6 decades. The basic structural bones of these aircraft were designed before the digital age, before integrated circuits, before fly-by-wire technology, before GPS. Everything that has been added since, the avionics, the communication systems, the weapons integration, the new radar, has been layered on top of an airframe that was never designed to carry any of it. The Air Force maintains these aircraft with extraordinary care and at considerable expense. But maintenance manages age. It doesn't eliminate it. Metal fatigue accumulates. Stress cycles add up, and the older an airframe becomes, the more complex every maintenance cycle grows, and the more precisely the maintenance team has to understand not just the individual components, but the way decades of wear have changed how those components interact. That's a manageable challenge under normal operating conditions. It becomes a more complicated challenge when you add new systems the aircraft was never designed around, and begin conducting flight tests at the edge of the flight envelope. Flight testing, by its nature, pushes aircraft into conditions that normal operations deliberately avoid. You're finding the limits, you're discovering the edge cases, and sometimes, as history has demonstrated repeatedly, you find them in ways nobody anticipated. The investigation will determine what happened to 60061, but the age of the airframe will be one of the contextual factors that investigation has to account for, because it raises a question that the entire $48.6 billion modernization program is built on top of. How much can you modernize a structure that is fundamentally 70 years old? The answer to that question matters more now than it did 24 hours ago. Let's place this crash in the context of what the Air Force is actually trying to accomplish, because the stakes here are larger than most people realize. The United States Air Force is currently executing one of the most ambitious aircraft modernization programs in its history. $48.6 billion. That number covers new avionics, new mission systems, the AN/APQ-188 radar integration that 60061 was supposed to prove. But the single largest component, a $15 billion effort, is the bomber engine replacement program. The goal? Remove the 8 Pratt & Whitney TF-33 engines that have powered the B-52H since the 1960s, and replace them with Rolls-Royce F-130 turbofan engines. Modern, fuel-efficient, significantly more capable. The engine replacement program just cleared critical design review, the major milestone that authorizes Boeing to begin physically modifying 2 B-52H aircraft for ground and flight testing later in 2026. When the full modernization package is complete, new radar, new engines, new AI-integrated avionics, the aircraft will be redesignated. It will no longer be the B-52H, it will be the B-52J. And the B-52J is intended to serve as the backbone of American long-range strike capability until the 2050s. Not as a museum piece, not as a heritage aircraft, as an active standoff arsenal bomber, an aircraft capable of carrying an enormous volume of precision cruise missiles from safe distances, while stealth aircraft like the B-21 Raider penetrate deeper into denied airspace. The strategic division of labor is elegant. The B-21 goes in quietly and close. The B-52J stays back and unleashes precision firepower from range. Together, they form a two-tiered strike capability that the Air Force plans to depend on for decades. Operation Epic Fury demonstrated what the B-52 can still do on a modern battlefield. The way it was used against IRGC targets showed that this aircraft, even in its current form, remains one of the most devastating strike platforms on Earth. 60,061 was supposed to prove what the next version of that aircraft could become. It's gone now, and that forces a question. Not about whether the program continues, it will, but about something more fundamental. What does this crash reveal about the underlying assumption that a 70-year-old airframe can sustain a $48 billion investment all the way to the 2050s? There is a moment from the B-52's past that becomes relevant every time an accident involving this aircraft is being analyzed. June 24, 1994. Fairchild Air Force Base, Washington State. A B-52H is practicing for an airshow demonstration. The pilot, a highly experienced aviator, has a well-documented history of performing aggressive, unauthorized maneuvers in the aircraft. Peers had raised concerns. Commanders were aware. The institutional response was essentially to accept it as a personality trait. That's just how he flies. On that June afternoon, the pilot attempts a sharp pylon turn around the control tower at extremely low altitude. The aircraft exceeds 90 degrees of bank. At that angle, at that altitude, there is no physics available to recover. The B-52H loses lift completely. It clips a power line. It impacts the ground. 4 crew members are killed. The accident investigation is among the most comprehensive in Air Force history. What it found was devastating. Not primarily about the aircraft, but about the culture surrounding it. A culture that allowed documented dangerous behavior to persist. a culture where concerns were raised and then absorbed without consequence. The Fairchild incident became a case study because it showed that the B-52's vulnerability windows, low altitude, critical phases of flight, the departure envelope, are real, and that operating in those windows requires not just technical precision, but institutional discipline. Now, and this cannot be overstated, there is absolutely no indication that anything resembling the Fairchild scenario was a factor at Edwards. Every signal points to this being a fundamentally different kind of event. A test flight, a potentially mechanical or systems failure, a tragedy without any of the cultural dimensions of 1994. But the history matters because of what it confirms. The B-52's critical vulnerability window is the same today as it was in 1994. Low, slow, departure phase. That's where it happened then. That's where 60061 was lost. And understanding that pattern is part of what investigators will bring to this inquiry. The Air Force investigation is underway. A safety investigation board and an accident investigation board will both be convened. Standard procedure following an aircraft loss of this significance. The process is thorough and methodical. The Air Force has indicated it could take up to 6 months before formal conclusions are published. But in this particular case, the investigation has access to something that may prove unusually valuable. Because 60061 was a test aircraft, equipped with instrumentation designed specifically to measure and record every system's performance in real time, the data available to investigators may be far more detailed than what typically survives a crash. Ground telemetry, flight data recording, systems monitoring packages watching the AN/APQ-188, the avionics integration, the hydraulic systems, and the flight control inputs all simultaneously. If a hydraulic anomaly developed, it may be in the data. If a newly integrated system sent an anomalous signal to the flight control bus, it may be in the data. If there was a mechanical failure unrelated to any of the new technology, that will be in the data too. The data doesn't tell the story all at once, but piece by piece, the picture will emerge. And whatever it shows, the Air Force faces an immediate parallel decision. A new test aircraft needs to be identified, modified, and equipped with the AN/APQ-188. The production decision for all 76 B-52H aircraft depends on data that can only be gathered in flight. Current estimates suggest a replacement test bed could potentially be operational within 6 months, assuming no complications in the modification process, and assuming the investigation doesn't surface something about the integration itself that requires a fundamental redesign approach. That's a significant pair of assumptions. The Air Force will be pushing hard on both fronts simultaneously, investigating what happened and building what comes next. Because the timeline for the entire B-52J program just got tighter in a way no one planned for. Here is the question that this crash puts on the table. Not loudly, not from official statements, but in the spaces between what's been confirmed and what hasn't been explained yet. The United States Air Force made a strategic choice. Rather than develop a new medium-range bomber to replace the B-52, it chose to invest $48.6 billion in modernizing an aircraft that first flew 70 years ago. That choice was made deliberately. The B-52 carries an unmatched combination of payload, range, and versatility that no currently available replacement can match at comparable cost. The B-21 Raider is the future of penetrating strike capability, but it cannot carry what a B-52 carries, at the range a B-52 can fly, from the standoff distances the modern threat environment demands. The B-52J fills a role that nothing else in the current or planned inventory can fill. So the decision to modernize rather than replace is defensible, perhaps even necessary. But the crash of 60061 exposes the tension at the center of that decision. You can give a 70-year-old airframe new radar. You can give it new engines. You can give it an AI brain that would have seemed like science fiction to the engineers who originally designed it. But you cannot give it a new airframe. You cannot change the fundamental flight control architecture. You cannot eliminate 6 decades of accumulated stress cycles. You can manage those realities. You can maintain them carefully. You can monitor them constantly. But you cannot make them disappear. And in the space between what modern technology can do and what a 70-year-old airframe can accommodate, there is risk. Managed risk. Understood risk. Risk that the Air Force accepts with eyes open, because the alternative, not having long-range standoff strike capability at all, is a far greater danger. But risk nonetheless. The crash of 60061 is a reminder of where that risk lives. 8 people did not come home from Edwards Air Force Base. That fact stands above everything else in this story. Whatever the investigation ultimately concludes, whatever decisions follow about replacement test aircraft and revised timelines, 8 individuals were the human cost of doing what test crews have always done. They were flying at the frontier, taking an aircraft to the edge of its envelope so that others could fly more effectively, more safely, with better tools on a more dangerous battlefield. That work carries enormous risk. And on the morning of June 15, 2026, that risk became reality in the most devastating way. But the story of what was lost extends beyond the 8 lives and beyond the aircraft. It extends to the program. The data that 60061 was supposed to gather, the data that would have justified the production decision for 76 aircraft, will have to be gathered again. A new test bed will be built. The investigation will conclude. The Air Force will incorporate what it learns. And the B-52J program will continue, because the strategic need that drives it hasn't changed. America needs long-range standoff strike capability. The B-52 is what delivers it. And $48.6 billion is already committed to making sure it can keep delivering it for decades to come. But the crash of the most advanced B-52 ever built, the aircraft that was supposed to show the world what this bomber could still become, is a moment that cannot simply be absorbed and moved past without examination. It asks a question that everyone involved with this program will spend the next 6 months trying to answer. A question that goes beyond what caused the hydraulic system to fail, or what triggered the flight control anomaly, or whatever the investigation ultimately finds. The deeper question is whether the gap between what the B-52 was built to be and what the Air Force needs it to become is a gap that can be permanently closed. Or whether the crash of 60061 is a warning, a signal from the airframe itself about how far a 70-year-old design can be pushed before it pushes back. The B-52 has outlasted everything: the world it was built for, the conflicts it was designed to deter, the aircraft designed to replace it. Whether it can outlast this moment and emerge on the other side as the B-52J the Air Force needs it to be, is now the defining question of American strategic aviation. And the answer is still being written. In the desert at Edwards, in the flight data recorders, in the investigation reports that haven't been published yet, and in whatever decision the Air Force makes when it builds the next test bed, puts a new crew on board, and tries again.